Good morning and welcome to the regular meeting of the Planning and Zoning Commission. Today's date is Wednesday, August 2nd, 2023. This meeting will now come to order and we'll begin with a moment of silence. Please stand for the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Madam City Clerk, will you please call the roll?
Yes, Chair. Before I begin, alternate King asked to be excused, and I will mark her so. Apking?
Here.
Benny? Batana? Here. Marker?
Here.
Severson?
Here.
Summers?
Here.
York? Here. And Schwartz.
Here.
8 present, 1 excused.
Thank you. Next item on the agenda is item 5. It's approval of minutes. A copy of the July 12th, 2023 regular meeting minutes were placed in your meeting backup material. Is there any discussion regarding these minutes? Motions?
Motion to approve. Second.
Motion to approve by Commissioner Benny, second by Commissioner Apkin. Madam City Clerk, will you please call the roll?
Aye.
Benny? Yes. Batana? Here, yes. Marker?
Aye.
Severson?
Aye.
Summers?
Aye.
York? Aye. Schwartz?
Aye.
All ayes, motion carried.
Thank you. All right, next item on the agenda, ordinance 66-23. Does staff have a presentation?
Yes, Chairman Marker. For the record, Mike Struve, Planning Team Coordinator with the Planning Division. Good morning again. This particular ordinance, the main effect of this change to our land development code would be to remove mandatory parking requirements for a rather small subset of properties in the South Cape zoning district. And all of these properties are located sort of centrally in the South Cape zoning district and what we sometimes refer to as the core area of this zoning district. This change, in our view, represents a measured incremental approach. While we have taken steps to deregulate parking in some cases, particularly in the South Cape and also in the mixed-use Bimini zoning district by implementing lesser parking standards in those zoning districts compared to many other zoning districts in the city. We have not previously proposed eliminating mandatory parking requirements anywhere in the South Cape. So this is really sort of a big step, I think, potentially for the city. This proposal also represents, we believe, a more flexible market-based approach towards parking. While we are removing minimum parking standards for these select properties, and I'll go over exactly what properties those are in a moment, if owners want to continue to provide parking on their sites, they can. We're just removing that minimum requirement for these sites. I'm going to be talking this morning about a couple of terms that sound the same but we use quite differently. The first are city parking areas, and these are properties that either the city owns or manages as basically parking lots. And there are 6 of those that are located in the South Cape zoning district, and the graphic on the left-hand side of the screen shows the general location of those 6 city parking areas. And those would include some pretty familiar names to many of you. The Big John's Plaza, the Guanamia parking lot, and Club Square are three examples. And collectively, these 6 city parking areas provide over 1,300, an estimated over 1,300 parking spaces for public use. Now, business owners that have properties that abut or are on the other side of an alley from these city parking areas can use these parking lots to meet their minimum parking requirements. But these parking lots, I want to emphasize, are also available for public use. And even though owners are entitled to use these parking lots to meet part of their minimum parking standards, they can't reserve those spaces. Those spaces are utilized on a first-come, first-served basis. Here I want to make a distinction between city parking areas, shown here, indicated by number 3 near the top part of the slide here, and this is the Guanamia parking area, as opposed to parking sites, which are private properties that either directly abut parking areas or are separated from these parking areas by either a platted alley or a walkway. A little bit of background about our current parking regulations. All of our parking regulations for all zoning districts in the city are contained in Article 6 of the Land Development Code. As I mentioned earlier, we do have more permissive or relaxed parking standards for both the South Cape District and the mixed-use Bimini zoning districts located just to the west of the South Cape. In the South Cape District, our parking standards, or the majority of them, are based on 2 factors for any particular use. It's based on the amount of frontage that you have along a street and the area of a site. And there's a table in Article 6 that is used to determine what your parking standard is. And in general, as the amount of frontage of your site increases and as the amount of area of your site increases, your parking standard, or the amount of parking you're required to provide, increases as well. Now, currently, owners of parking lot sites can use city parking areas to meet part of their minimum required parking. And how we determine that is based on a table, again, found in Article 6 and as part of Ordinance 66-23. And we take the area of these sites and we multiply it by a parking allocation factor that is unique for each city parking area. And that yields a number that we then round to a whole number. So for a particular site, after you multiply the area of the site by the parking allocation factor, you might get a number hypothetically like 10. That number would then be, that would be the number of spaces that a person could depend on or would be entitled to use in a city parking area. And that number would be subtracted from their total required parking area from the site. Say 30 is what they're required to provide. You subtract 10 from 30, you're left with 20. 20 is what you would be required to provide on your site itself. So that's sort of how the parking standards and how the parking calculations work for these parking area sites. We're proposing to change all that and really to simplify this. The new language in this particular ordinance states that parking standards that appear in Table 6.1.7b shall not apply to any site abutting a city parking area, again, of which there are 6 of, or a site within 25 feet of a city parking area, excluding an alley or a walkway. That same table, Table 6.1.7b, has been amended to remove a footnote that references the use of parking credits and parking area sites, because these parking credits would no longer exist if we're removing the minimum parking requirements for these sites. Table 6.1.8A has been amended to eliminate parking allocation factors because we would no longer be relying on parking allocation factors since we are proposing to eliminate those minimum parking requirements. And then lastly, text regarding parking credits and the alteration of parking area sites has been eliminated under a subsection of Article 6 that's entitled Supplemental Parking Requirements. And that, if you look in Ordinance 66-23, there are about 3 pages consecutively towards the end, which are all struck through. And this is the text that I'm referring to here. That would no longer need to be administered or would be germane. There are several advantages, we believe, to eliminating the parking requirements for this grouping of properties. Also, a couple potential disadvantages that I'd like to review with you. One is that it would eliminate a costly mandatory requirement for properties that we believe no longer should be required to provide parking. Most sites in the city, we believe, still should have minimum parking standards, so we're not talking about lifting these requirements for the C or the P zoning district or any other zoning district for that matter. And the reason for that is because much of the city is been developed in sort of a suburban fashion where we're very dependent on our automobiles to get from place to place. That's a little bit different in the South Cape for 2 reasons. One, we have infrastructure in terms of these parking areas that allow people to park and to close proximity to multiple businesses. And because of that, this area in the South Cape is much more walkable. It's much more realistic to park once and then to walk to multiple businesses. Secondly, this will increase the land that would be available for development or redevelopment activities. As these parking lots for some properties are eliminated over time, we would expect these areas that would otherwise be required to support parking may now be able to support a larger building footprint. Related to that, as parking lots are eliminated over time, driveway cuts should be reduced or eliminated on some of these properties, and that should have some safety benefits for pedestrians in the South Cape District. It might also help to improve or enhance the flow of traffic over time, as there would be fewer reasons for cars to slow down to allow for turning movements into these properties. I already covered number 4, but we believe this change will encourage people to walk more to their destinations or to multiple destinations in the South Cape. One thing that may not be quite so obvious, and this advantage, like several of these advantages, are not benefits that we would see overnight, but we would expect to see over time. But we do believe that we might see some improvements to urban form over time. And by that, I mean as parking lots are eliminated and sites are developed or redeveloped, we would expect buildings to be built closer to the sidewalk, to the street itself. That's going to help to activate that street frontage, to make those areas and those businesses more inviting to people to pass along. And related to that, we think that that may have a stimulatory effect on economic development in this area. If you create an area that is more inviting to the public, one might expect more people to visit that area of the city, and we think that more people that visit the South Cape District over time is going to translate to more dollars being spent in that area over time as well. In terms of disadvantages, there are a couple of potential disadvantages. I think some of these are largely perceptions, but they're still, I think, very worthwhile to go over. One, it would eliminate a perceived entitlement, because these property owners currently are entitled to use these city parking areas to meet part of their mandatory parking requirements. That being said, the loss of that entitlement, we believe, will be more than offset from the simple fact that these owners will no longer have any parking requirement for their sites. Number two, this may create some short-term confusion on where some of these business owners, or I should say, where some of these patrons of businesses can park. That's not going to change overnight, but it could cause some confusion. People that want to visit businesses in the South Cape can still use those city parking areas, just like they are today. That's not going to change for those business owners that have parking on their site, which would be the majority of them. They can still park in those parking lots as well. Again, we're certainly not advocating that people eliminate their parking lots, particularly if they feel they need parking on their sites. We're just lifting that mandatory requirement to do so. And then lastly, this would represent a permanent change. This is not something that once is adopted that the city could easily claw back or decide to reverse. So that's one reason why we've heard some comments from some people that, while they think this is a good change, that we should be more aggressive. It's one reason why we want to take this slow and do this in a measured, incremental fashion, wait and see how businesses react before we consider future changes, either in the South Cape or elsewhere. I'm not going to discuss this in any great detail, but certainly if you have questions about it, I'll be glad to answer them. From a policy standpoint, this particular amendment is consistent with two policies that appear in the South Cape Downtown CRA plan. It's consistent with several policies that appear in our comprehensive plan, either the future land use element or the economic development element. And then lastly, it's consistent with review criteria that we use for evaluating proposed land development code text amendments found in section 3.5.4. We are recommending approval of this change. This ordinance is tentatively scheduled to be considered by the City Council on September 6th. We did review these proposed changes with the CRA board yesterday. It was just an informational item on their agenda. They had a couple of questions but didn't indicate any concern regarding this particular ordinance, and I will certainly stand by in case you have questions.
Thank you, Mr. Truvy. This is a public meeting. Now I'd like to open to the public. If there's any members of the audience that wish to speak, please direct yourself to the podium and state your full name for the record.
This is not a specific item, not citizens' comments. So are you here to talk on this item?
Yes. One, I just want to state that people do not walk. You look at Cape Coral Parkway, anywhere around there. I used to be at the gym, Gulf Coast Fitness. You never see anybody walking. They like to park. They like to go into the restaurant, which is mainly what's there. There's no clothing stores. There's no supermarkets except for Winn-Dixie, which has its own huge parking space. So they like to park, they like to walk, and they like to leave. They don't need all these buildings close by the street, which is what's going on, that big building, I don't know, what's it called, Cape something or other. It's going to be stories high. That's not the feel that people in Cape Coral want to have. They don't want to have an urban area like, I'm going to say New York City, but they have a lot of big sidewalks. They like the smallish feel. They like the trees. They don't want to have a zillion restaurants and no parking. They just like to park, eat, and leave. Thank you.
Ma'am, would you please state your name for the record as well?
Eileen Benazia. Sorry, it's on the list.
Of course. Thank you.
Good morning. Art Castellanos, architect, 1228 Lafayette Street. So I've worked in Southgate for about 20 years now. My partner worked there 5 years before me, so he's been there 30 years. I've been here before the board explained the issues with the Southgate district development-wise. It's not, there is no urban feel down in Southgate. There is no downtown feel. Yes, there's some issues with, there's a lot of issues with on-street, on-site parking. I've got a couple of developers that wanted to buy some parcels over there and could not buy them because it's, the on-site parking requirements are very onerous. The lots are very small. It's 5,000 square foot lots. 90% of it is 5 to 10,000 square foot lots. You can't build anything when you got to park 20 cars on that site. It's just not economically feasible to build anything, and that's why the downtown district is falling behind the town across the river here, because there is no forward thinking. This is a good step in the right direction. I don't think it does enough. My parcel, my property is 100 feet from this place, so I'm not going to benefit at all from this 25 feet. Most of those buildings that were shown up there are right across the Club Square property, which already use that parking. So, yes, I agree with this. This is a step in the right direction, but we need to go further for removing the parking requirements in South Cape so that construction, you know, if you want construction and buildings in South Cape to make it a downtown urban feel, the parking requirements need to be removed from the on-site of these parcels. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Castellano. Is there anybody else from the audience that wishes to speak regarding this item? Seeing none, we'll close citizens' input. I'll turn it over to the commission for comments. Do we have any comments from the commissioners? Commissioner Schwartz?
I guess my only question really is, because I also kind of like the idea of it, but is this going to result in pay to park? Are we going to be charging the citizens to park where it's now free to park?
So I don't believe the city has any plans to charge residents to park in the 6 city parking areas. A question came up yesterday in the context of a couple of the developments that are under development now in regards to parking garages that are parts of those developments. The Cove at 47th, for example, came up. And the city has the CRA has an agreement with that developer to allow for public use of a little over 100 parking spaces. And I believe our deputy city attorney stated yesterday that there hadn't been a decision on whether or not the CRA would charge people to park in that parking garage. That apparently is something that the CRA could do. But in terms of the existing city parking areas themselves, Big John's, Iguana Mia, Club Square, not aware of there being any effort to charge people to park there, just like they can park for free there now.
Are there any plans to turn those into parking garages?
Not exclusively into parking garages, although it is possible that over time the city may be involved in developing parts of one or more of those properties into a parking garage.
That would be my only apprehension is the fact that are we going to start charging for free parking?
And if the city were to do that, I think there would be every effort taken to ensure that the number of spaces that exist today were not diminished by the construction of that parking garage.
Okay, thank you.
Commissioner Botana?
Touched the wrong thing. Yeah, well, I had a couple of questions. One was, will this ordinance change as it is now going to lessen the number of public parking spaces in the downtown area?
No.
And you mentioned that the adoption of this would allow larger buildings without the requirement to have parking. It struck me that a larger building would mean there's going to be more patrons and more employees, therefore a larger parking requirement if larger buildings were allowed to be built on whatever empty spaces there are down there. So it is going to contribute to exacerbate the already, what my personal opinion is already a parking shortage in that downtown area. So it would only make it worse. So similar to Commissioner Schwartz, but perhaps in contrary to him, I think there should be consideration of a parking structure on one or more of those parking lots. But my concern would be that you're gonna put more pressure on the existing parking by allowing larger places to be built.
I understand where that does seem a little counterintuitive. Again, that's going to depend on what any particular developer or business owner's plan is. And what we are doing here, we think, is giving the owner freedom to determine whether or not they're going to have a viable business without providing parking on the site. If they think they can, because they're close to an existing city parking area, or they're going to enter into some type of shared parking agreement with another site that may have a surplus of parking, they're free to do that without providing parking on their site. I suspect that a number of owners will decide that they need at least some parking. But that's, again, why we want to take a very measured approach on this, try this for a relatively small number of properties and see how it works over time. I think most other communities that have taken such measures have found that the advantages of lifting these parking requirements in terms of stimulating economic development have far outweighed, in general, concerns about exasperating existing parking problems and some of the other concerns that are sometimes raised about removing mandatory parking requirements. But we'll see.
Commissioner York?
The businesses that abut the parking areas now, are you finding that they're generally in support of getting rid of the mandatory or the requirements for a certain number of parking? Or are you finding that they're not in support of it?
So to my knowledge, we have not surveyed those owners door to door about that. So I really wouldn't want to be in a position where I'm
Right.
Assuming what their collective mindset might be about that. The only thing, again, that I would emphasize is that if those owners have existing parking on their sites and they want to maintain them, they're free to do that. If they choose to redevelop their sites and they want to provide whatever parking they feel is necessary to make sure that their business is viable, they're free to do that as well. We're just lifting this mandatory requirement that says currently you have to provide X number of spaces on your sites.
Okay, so were they, you know how sometimes, well, most of the time, if you're doing a land use change, you send notice to people affected. Were these people that abut public parking areas, were they given special notice, like a letter going to them about this?
No, they were not. That's not required by our code because
Right.
this involves a change to our land development code, and we're not required, for example, to individually notice individual property owners, like we would be on a rezoning case, for example.
Okay, I figured that because it's not, but I wonder then if they're even aware of this. We do have the one business owner that came forward, but his property doesn't abut the public parking areas. I just wonder if they feel it's a positive thing or a negative thing for them. And you don't, it sounds like you don't really know, and I don't know.
I don't want to speculate.
No, you don't want to speculate. And we mentioned in passing, I think it's part of the deleted text, the payment in lieu of parking, PLOP. We don't currently have that. Is that right at all?
That is correct. We are waiting, there's several different transportation-related studies that are ongoing
Okay.
right now, which includes a parking study. And one of the products that we expect to come out of that parking study would be a recommendation on a fee for in lieu parking. And once we get that fee and have a chance to examine that, then we would anticipate that we would bring the pilot program forward to the city council with a companion resolution that would provide a fee for pilot.
Okay, so it's not being done now. And do you happen to know there are certain walkable cities that I think about that aren't far from here. I think about downtown Naples, downtown St. Pete. Do you know if they have parking requirements now? Is the trend to do this in cities that tend to be more progressive? And I take it that we're moving toward a place where people live and also walk around, shop, eat out, and that kind of thing. But do you know what the trend is for other cities?
The trend overall, if you're looking either in the state of Florida or across the country, is to relax parking standards. The only city that I am aware of that largely has eliminated all their parking standards in Florida, I believe, is Gainesville.
Is what?
Is Gainesville.
Oh, Gainesville, okay.
I was doing a little research yesterday, and on this website that deals with parking reform, they had mentioned that there's roughly 25 cities nationwide, I believe, according to the website, that have eliminated their parking standards basically for their entire municipality. There's a considerable number of other municipalities that have not eliminated parking requirements throughout their jurisdiction, but have eliminated parking requirements either for certain uses in certain zoning districts, for certain areas of the city, for certain areas near mass transit, or have just relaxed parking standards in certain situations. So the general overall trend is certainly towards relaxing parking standards in this country.
Oh, it is, okay. And how many cities did you say?
According to the website, 25, but when I started counting the dots on the map, it looked like more than 25 to me, so.
Okay. And some of them have relaxed like we're doing, or like you're suggesting, I should say.
Yeah, the 25 that I referred to, according to this website, were the municipalities that have completely eliminated parking. There is a much larger number that have reformed their parking code to relax parking standards for either some zoning districts or parts of their jurisdictions.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Do we have a comment from the Assistant City Attorney as well?
Thank you, John Niclerio, Assistant City Attorney. Just for the record, I'd just like to clarify that although individual notice is not mailed to surrounding properties, this is a public meeting, publicly advertised, and of course, one business owner was aware of the public meeting. So I'm not, it was not in the dark as far, I just want to make that clear on the record.
Perfect. Thank you. And back to the commission, Commissioner Binney.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to get some clarification. Is this change only affecting properties that are within this 25-foot or whatever range of an existing city parking site? So the gentleman, the business owner that spoke to us here, he's concerned because he's not going to get the same relief from the requirement. It seems like if this is a commitment to change it, maybe it should be approached a little more broadly than just
The
people who
actual-
already have parking lots across the street.
The actual lot and block numbers are actually identified in the ordinance, so you can go through and see the individual lots and blocks and the lots within each block where these mandatory parking requirements would be eliminated. But in a broader sense, yes, we're proposing to eliminate these parking requirements for all sites that either abut these 6 city parking areas or are separated from these city parking areas by a platted alley or walkway.
Well, I would just voice the opinion that it perhaps should be looked at more broadly. I mean, this is step one, but I believe that it now becomes an equity issue where people are being, disproportionately affected based on the location of their businesses. So that concerns me a bit. And then as for the Cove, the 100 parking spots that are going to be there, is the understanding that those will be available for any public use or only for those using facilities inside the development or who,
I believe the idea is, actually, I'm going to refer that to our city attorney because I'm not intimately familiar with the contract.
I'm not aware of whether, the terms of the use of the parking garage.
It was my understanding it would be available for public use on a first come, first served basis until it was full.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Benny. Any other comments from the commissioners? Perfect. Well, Mr. Shrewsbury, we appreciate your work on this and also the comments from the public. I think it's helpful for all of us. This is something that we've looked at since, I think, 2019 is where this first came up. I do believe personally that this is something that's important for the development of the Southeast Cape and downtown Cape area. It's something that I know business owners, developers, investors look at, and it does definitely restrict the ability for that area of the city to develop, much as we see in other towns and cities across the state. But with that said, Commission, do we have a motion?
Motion to approve the ordinance?
Motion to approve. Second, okay. So motion by Commissioner Sommers, and we're going to do a second by Commissioner Botana to approve ordinance 66-23. Madam City Clerk, will you please call the roll?
Apking?
Aye.
Benny? Yes. Botana? Aye. Marker?
Aye.
Severson?
Aye.
Summers?
Aye.
York?
Aye.
7 ayes. Motion passed.
Thank you, Madam City Clerk. We're going to move on to the next item, item 8. So this is citizens' input, general input on any items. If there's any members of the audience that wish to speak, please direct yourself to the podium and state your full name for the record.
Members of the Zoning Commission, my name is Bill Barrett, and I'm here today to urge you to oppose, when the time comes, the rezoning of Redfish Point, which is currently zoned as a wildlife preserve, to a mixed-use area which would allow it to be used for a huge development of 800 residential units, a 300-room hotel, a 125-space parking lot, 200 boat marina, and commercial spaces for restaurants, bars, and stores. My wife and I live on El Dorado Park, just right across the street from Rotary Park and Redfish Point. When Hurricane Ian hit last September, its wind and storm surge destroyed the complete inside of our house. All of the walls, the floors, the appliances, 90% of all of our personal possessions, plus all of the furniture, and all of our clothes and memorabilia that we had acquired over 50 years. We also lost 2 cars and a boat. We were able to move out, we were able to move back in only a couple of months ago, and we're still in the process of restoration and repairs on the house. Only last week we took possession of our new furniture, our new bedroom furniture, and we're having more furniture delivered this Friday. So it's been a long process, and it's been a tough year. But even with all these damages, we consider ourselves lucky because we were protected by the mangroves of Redfish Point. Without those mangroves, we would have suffered worse damages, far worse damages. Mangroves protect our coastlines, they help prevent erosion, but most importantly at all, they help mitigate and defend against the ravages of hurricanes. The current developmental plan for Redfish Point calls for removal and development of 110 acres of prime wetlands and mangroves. This is a third of the complete area of the preserve. Mangroves are an incredible protective barrier, but if you remove even a part of them, it compromises the integrity of that system and it makes them vulnerable. This is what would happen if we rezoned Redfish Point. And if this happens, it would endanger the lives and the properties of 3,500 people who surround that preserve. And please let me repeat it. If those mangroves and that area is compromised, it would endanger the lives and the properties of 3,500 people in the neighborhood. This is clearly a disaster that's just waiting to happen. But that disaster is even compounded even further because insurance companies are now moving out of Florida. Just a couple of weeks ago, Farmers Insurance said that it announced that they will be moving out and they will be gone by the end of the year, and there's others going to be following. So we have a situation where not only would the protection of the mangroves disappear. Thank you for the opportunity of speaking today.
We appreciate your comments, sir.
Good morning. Recently, there was a meeting at Rotary Park concerning the development.
Ma'am, if you could just state your...
Oh, sorry, Eileen
name for the
Venezia.
record. Thank you.
Recently, there was a meeting at Rotary Park concerning the development called Redfish Point Mixed-Use Future Land Use District. There have been articles in the paper about the development. Many people have spoken regarding the destruction of wetlands, mangroves, and the effect on wildlife. Today, I would like to point out one major item that I believe has been lightly touched upon by the developer and the city staff. In the April 20th, 2021 response from the city to various people representing the owners, the utilities director stated, "The area immediately north is built out and the mains were sized accordingly." This regards water. The proposed development would likely require extensive off-site infrastructure upgrades to serve that level of density they are proposing. In the March 3rd, 2023 letter of intent, policy 4.1 states, "Future developments requiring access or connection to public water and sewer facilities will be located within either the urban services infill or transition areas. The engineering firm has stated that public water and sewer facilities are located within this area to serve this development. An extension of these services will be required." Again, this is strictly just about water. In June 2023, the response by the City of Cape Coral Public Works Environmental Resources Preliminary Review stated, "There is no study or provision to incorporate utilities lines within this project that may result in further wetland impacts or crossing of the remaining resources preservation portion of the property." Now, most people will be asking, well, how far away is the nearest water? What construction will be needed to bring water to the area? How long will it take? The closest wells I've seen on the city master plan are around Aqualinda Boulevard and Southwest 32nd Street. Now, since April 2021, when the utilities director stated that the area has been built out already, I don't believe there have been any new mains installed, so I ask, how will residents who live along the roads from the wells and water plants feel when the roads are torn up so water mains can be installed for 800 residential units, 300 hotel rooms, and the offices, retail stores, and restaurants in this development? Will the construction be along Cape Coral Parkway, side roads, Skyline Boulevard, Pelican Boulevard? How long will it take? And no matter who pays for this construction, there will be many residents and businesses affected by just this phase of the construction. This is a large part of the development which seems to have been glossed over. Roads dug up, construction going on outside of the development, and many people inconvenienced. This development does not make economic sense, and just the cost of bringing in water, and let's not forget irrigation water and sewer, seems cost prohibitive. Thank you.
Thank you. In your name one more time, I'm sorry, I didn't get it the first time.
Eileen
Eileen, in your last name?
Benazia,
Anesia, thank
it's
you.
right here.
Good morning. My name is Patty Gard. I appreciate the opportunity to be here this morning to express my strong opposition to the proposed Redfish Point development in the wetlands just south of Rotary Park. My remarks will be brief this morning. Just over a decade ago, my husband and I visited friends who lived on one of the 8 lakes in Southwest Cape. The night before we were to return home, our friend said he had seen a home for sale on the next lake over. Why didn't we get the real estate agent to show it to us? We did, and we fell in love with that home on El Dorado Parkway West in Cape Coral. We bought it that night. We got acquainted with the Rotary Park. We fell in love with Rotary Park. The green provided habitat for wildlife, birds, butterflies, as well as endangered species. We were in awe of the mangroves as we walked out the path to the observation deck where we could view acres of wetlands. We loved the manatees and dolphins and pelicans that visited our lake. This truly was paradise. 10 years later, on September 28th of last year, our lives changed forever. Our home sits on El Dorado Parkway West, just at the intersection of Pelican Boulevard and Rose Garden. It faces the vacant city-owned lot that begins at El Dorado Parkway West and runs south to Rose Garden to 6th Place. We did all we could to prepare our home for damage before we evacuated. But when we were able to return home 2 days later, we found significant damage from surge and flooding. We had water on the floors and a 12-inch water line around the entire house, including on the furniture. We knew we had a very short amount of time to get everything we owned out to the street before mold set in. This was a difficult task, not only from the emotional trauma involved in seeing the devastation, but also because my husband had recently undergone back surgery and I was scheduled to have knee surgery. So the two of us in our mid-70s were tasked with dragging everything we owned out to the street. Fortunately, we were able to hire people next door, working next door, to get our furniture out. We lost everything, including cars, boat, our landscape, and our personal belongings. We spent 6 months in a rental while our roof and the inside of our house was repaired. Not long after Hurricane Ian hit, we saw a video of waist-high storm surge gushing up Rose Garden. We knew what caused the damage. We know there are going to be more hurricanes, possibly more powerful than Eden, as well as sea level rise. We know from Eden that storm surge destroys property, and as we saw with our neighbors in Fort Myers, storm surges can cause death. We ask you, how could the city consider approving this huge development knowing that mangroves help protect coastlines from flooding when hurricanes hit and also help stabilize coastlines? We urge you to reject this proposal. Thank you for listening.
Thank you. Thank you for your comments, Mrs. Gard. Is there anybody else from the audience that wishes to speak? Seeing none, we will close citizens' input. We'll move on to item 9, staff updates. Are there any updates from staff?
No updates from staff, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Seeing none, we'll move on to item 10, other business. Is there any other business from the clerk's side? Nope. All right. Moving on to the next item. Item 11, member comments. Any comments from the members? Seeing none, we'll move on to item 12, and that's time and date of our next meeting. The next regular meeting for Planning and Zoning Commission is scheduled for Wednesday, September 6th, 2023 at 9 a.m. here in council chambers. Do I have a motion to adjourn? Motion by Commissioner
Second.
Botana, second. All opposed? Any opposed? All in favor? Aye. This meeting's come to a close.